Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I apparently am the Dread Pirate Taco Hat, but again, I don't dress up enough lately, and I wanted to pull out some of the various things I have from my closet, so here we are. But anyhow, I am doing this as part 2 of a video response to a comment left behind on one of my videos by John Lanman. He asked for a bit of information and a deep dive into some of the games and systems that I have experience with, and well, if you ask me to do something, I will do it. So this is my response in kind of an informal video response kind of fashion. The full question was this, and I'll break out the spectacles as my old eyes are not what they once were. I'm really interested in exploring the different RPG systems available to boutique design firms like my own. Do you think you'd ever be interested in doing a video in which you compared and contrasted these different systems like SRD5, 1/D20, GURPS, Fudge, Fate, etc.? You touched a little on games that use some of these during your Vault tour, but it would be cool to get a more detailed overview of what's available out there. I'd also be interested in your insights on rights restrictions, level of marketplace for the various systems, and even your opinions on the chances for an independent RPG studio to compete in a world so dominated by Wizards of the Coast. Love what you do. Thanks. Now, the first video I did was mostly about core game system design and the different systems that are available. The percentile system, the D20 system, Fate and Fudge, using cards, different methods. And I think I did a pretty good job of covering most of the games that I have and how those work. Most of them are some sort of derivation of those mechanics. Twilight 2000 originally was based off of percentile, and then they just basically truncated it to a sliding D10. GURPS, we covered a little bit. We covered no other game really in my experiences have gone into something in GURPS mechanics the way they did. So they're fine. We covered Shadowrun and their core systems, including the dice pool defense systems. Of course, we looked at D&D and all the variants, and was the World of Darkness, which also includes games like Exalted, which is World of Darkness. So all in all, that was, I think, a fairly good thumbnail of the systems that I have. But we covered just the core systems and resolutions. There's more to system mechanics than that. The next system to really talk about is character design and basically using the system to describe a character and what they're capable of. So Dungeons & Dragons, for instance, is the one that almost everybody is familiar with in gaming. It breaks down your character into 6 primary traits called the attributes. And that is strength, your dexterity, your constitution, your intelligence, your wisdom, and your charisma. Now, back in the day, TSR would go and hammer anybody who dared to call their stuff those statistics as they were pursuing their copyrights wherever they could. These days, with the open game license, as long as you attribute Wizards of the Coast, you can freely use those. Well, again, it's not free, but it doesn't cost you any money, and that's the important thing. But you need some way to define your character, because your players, they could be left technically in a game to completely freelance and say, well, of course my character can do this. If your game doesn't delineate what they can and can't do, then there's nothing stopping them, and they have to make some assumptions about what they can do and what they can't. But if the system tells them what their characters are good at and not so good at, then they can plan around that, and they can actually define roles for their characters within the group. That's one half of the term role-playing game, actually. Is your character's job, what you are good at. The other half of role is, of course, the dramatis personae, the role that you give them is the personality of the character and all that other stuff. Some of which can also be delineated in game terms, see alignment and things like that, but mostly we're going to talk about the numbers and statistics and, more importantly, I think, overall, advancing your character through experience and such. Now, here's the first thing to know. Number one, it's all optional. You could, with you could just play pretend and just not define anything. It's possible. You can play a role-playing game with a coin for heads and tails. Actually, my Wandering Hat Club is, or the Traveling Hat Club game, uses coins, doesn't use dice, because a coin is a two-sided die, actually, but yeah, it's fine. But, getting distracted here. Most games want to define, to some extent, your character. It can be very, very loose, going on, for example, what, the Princess Bride, the role-playing game, which uses the fudge system. You go from absolutely abysmal, which is a -2, to legendary, which is +7. So it's a sliding scale of about 10 points. Okay. So it's very straightforward. You can tell that somebody who is terrific at something is going to be better than someone who is mediocre at something. The relativity of those numbers has a meaning to most people. And I think they did a pretty good job of coming up with the right descriptions as showing an advancement and acceleration in potency or aptitude. That is a fairly simple but elegant system for doing that, and most games, as I said, have some element of doing that. Now, a game like Dungeons & Dragons wants to define all of the aspects of your character so that you can get comfortable in the character themselves. Therefore, the most broad strokes are used, but does encompass most elements of your character's personality. If you want to know if they'll succumb to a particular thing, like temptation, well, you've got wisdom to help them to navigate those problems. If they'll survive a disease, they've got their constitution to fight against that. If they're going to survive against blasts of magical flame, they have their dexterity that help them to get around that. Now, as the game has developed, before they used to have arbitrary numbers for those, your saving throws. Very famous way of deciding if you're going to pass or fail. Again, match or exceed your number on a 20-sided die roll, and yay, you've made your saving throw. And that was about it. There was no manipulation of those numbers. Sometimes a weak attack might have a penalty or a bonus, but for most part, your numbers were just what you had at the level you were at, and they would go down periodically as you advanced in level to show that you were more capable of avoiding the kind of threats that are common for adventurers to face. That is another element of the system. An element of, how your character can react to things. And the advancement means that those numbers declining increases your chance of success. Again, it's showing advancement and improvement. So figuring out what's important for the character in your game is important in general. It's one of the first things that you should think about when, really trying to nail down what is going to be my character creation process. What is going to be the elements of a character in my game? For instance, in my game, the default for everybody is a D4 in every statistic. If you have no skill or something in it, you can always roll a 4-sided die and try. Who knows? You might even succeed. And if you get some circumstances to help you out, you give yourself an advantageous position and maybe a piece of gear that might help, you can roll more dice and still have a better chance of success, or at least doing well. You may not be able to succeed at the most difficult of tasks, though, if you don't have a certain amount of aptitude or just the right tool or something like that. So, that's intentional. I don't want everybody to be able to succeed at anything. I don't want somebody to just roll a 20-sided die and say, I roll natural 20, I succeed no matter what. No, some things you just can't succeed. I can't fly without the right tool, a plane, a backpack, a jetpack, or something. I can't fly, no matter how well I roll. I can jump and try to fly, and I will fail every time, because the difficulty is clearly far more than my D4 ability to be able to leave the ground for extended periods of time. Straightforward and simple. So, figuring that out is kind of important. Now, you're starting to get into some gray areas as far as copyright goes with borrowing freely from other people. That's why Wizards of the Coast made it a little simpler with their open game license. You have to attribute Wizards of the Coast for coming up with the system and owning the core system that you're using. So there is that, but it's a relatively light burden compared to, fighting legal battles and things. So at least give them credit for that. And, it's a smart marketing move on their part because they guarantee that more people are making stuff for their systems than anybody else, which is still true. But, like I said, all games have that. Now, some games deliberately eschew advancement. For an example, bloat games The Blackest of Deaths. Your character never gets better. You're just staying one step ahead of dying and hoping to get what you can and get out while you're still alive and with most of your limbs attacked. They never want your characters to feel super heroic or even much better than kind of good. So your character is basically just going for a score that they can survive off of, and knowing that the longer they stay out, even against what seems to be an inconsequential foe, they're going to die at some point in a grisly, gruesome death. That's intentional. It's a direct reaction against the perception that Dungeons & Dragons creates superheroic characters that can't really die. There's too many things that keep characters alive. Letting them survive through negative hit points? Bah! You hit 0 hit points, you're dead. Death saving throws? Pfft. What, does your mom still hold your hand and cut your crusts off of your bread? No! You die. That's it. Dead, 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 dead. Make another character. Be done. Dead. And for the people who like that game, cool. It is a valid game construct. Any advancement that you get from your experiences is relatively going to be quite small. So, again, your character is deliberately going to be less powerful than a lot of the threats that are coming up against them. And that creates a certain kind of drama. You don't want your characters to die, but the fact that it's on the table at all times means that you're never going to get all that attached to your characters. It's going to be more of an old school approach where you roll your character, and if they die, you just whip up another one and away you go. Now, in my own table, I am running a game of original Dungeons, not old school, 0 edition Dungeons & Dragons, but this version of Dungeons & Dragons. And I've had 3 character deaths in the first adventure. What happened? Did the characters bewail their fate? Did they yell at me? Did they insist it was not fair? No, they hit 0 hit points. I handed them a character sheet, took my brown marker, scrawled dead on it. Matter of fact, right there, dead. And that was it. No funeral, no anything. That's part of the game. Death is always around the corner, and when you're at first level, you can die very easily, and they did. So, just a bad turn of events, nothing terrible that they did, and one was just purely, rookie mistake, which, again, he's a rookie. It's fine. It's a growing experience. I think losing a few characters sometimes can be one of those things that helps you to be a better gamer overall down the road, not take so much for granted. But that's how they choose to play, and in old school fashion, that is kind of an element that you're capturing, is that your characters aren't super heroic. They are normal folks who have a chance of getting really good, but the odds are against them because death is always around the corner. If you value that kind of thing, coming up with some basic statistics, because you don't want to complicate things with a lot of character creation, can be as simple as, I want a body statistic for strength and health and constitution and dexterity, and I want a spirit statistic. That's purely based on intelligence, personality, and everything. And that's it. If I want to, the easiest character you can have, there you go. In the game 316, Carnage Amongst the Stars, you have 2 attributes. You have combat ability and non-combat ability. That's it. And if you're, and the sum of the 2 add up to 10. So if you want to have an 8 in combat ability, you are an amazing soldier. You're going to have a 2 in non-combat ability. You probably can't tie your shoes or anything. It's a good thing for Velcro, honestly. And that is perfectly valid too. It fits that particular idiom. That it's a quick, fast-paced game where the characters' lives aren't all that important in the grand scheme of things. It only comes after time and experiences and shared experiences with the others in your group that those characters have any significance at all. But how much of a focus you want on exactitude of your character is going to drive your mechanics as far as characters are concerned. Again, I'll use my game as an example. Everybody is equally terrible at everything, but you have some things that can really elevate your abilities. For instance, you consider the plight of an office worker. Common office worker, every day they come in and they have to do a menial task. Sometimes they will roll poorly and they will flub up or there will be a complication. But there are things around them to help them out. They may have a supervisor that can come in and throw a die if they're having problems. They might have a tool like a computer and the right programs that may give them a bonus die to roll so that the incidents of failure are relatively minor, rarely disastrous, and if they personally are going to have a problem, they have other things to fall back on. Likewise, the incidents of two people swinging at each other, say they both have big, great swords and they're wearing plated armor, which could be potentially a fairly long battle between the two of them. Now, if, say, they both have poor levels in skill, they can spend a lot of time swooshing those swords around, but the sword is going to have a much greater play on if it does damage. If they manage to hit, the fact they're hitting with a big sword might actually do damage much more likely than the fact that they're incompetent at swinging. That's almost going to be doing the damage despite the fact that they're swinging. And on the other hand, the other person is going to avoid the damage more because they're wearing the plated armor, more so than if they're a complete clod, than their ability to nimbly dodge out of the way. They're probably going to have a fairly poor basic attribute. And that is how my game is kind of designed to run, and that it takes all those things into account, and the most important factor in a given situation is going to apply. And it would really take a failure of everything for a disaster to happen. Like, if both of those dice end up being a 1, the sword might fly out of their hands and they would lose. Possible. Not incredibly likely, but it's possible. The more dice you roll, the less likely that is. So, as long as the character creation system, we're going to switch to French Admiral mode, as long as your system has a purpose for all of those things, that should generally be what drives your core mechanics. A purpose to something should be, in my mind, for modern marketability at least, simplicity, familiarity, and flexibility. So, simplicity, people generally these days are more casual in their approach to gaming. They don't like complicated mechanics. Dungeons & Dragons really is about as complicated as I'd ever urge anybody to get. Roll a single die, success or fail for almost everything you do. Add basic math, not 3rd edition where you've got all these different modifiers. No, that was too far. Basic math, just 1 or 2 attributes at the most. Nothing that's going to be more than a +5. And keep the math down to a minimum, because that does turn off people. That has a chilling effect on how your game is perceived. Break everything down to a reason for all of the numbers. For example, my armor class is my target for other things to hit me, so there's a reason for that. My modifiers are a static number that I'm going to be referring to periodically, and they're all based off of my derived attributes. There's a purpose for all of that. Extraneous stuff should be stripped away at every opportunity. As engineer philosophy goes, you're not finished with the design of something when there's more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. And I think that's very important in game design. A lot of games could really have learned that. One of the greatest failures of a game was a game called Fatal. Now, there's a number of reasons why it was such a hideous failure of a game. The latent racism and puerile humor and just was a big part of it. But another part of it was needlessly complicated. Your character had numerous attributes. Many of them had to be resolved with quadratic equations and different things for reality. No. Somebody was having a good time with their math, and no. It was more complicated than anybody would ever really want to go to. Only those people who were hardcore for the game, which I'm guessing is probably a closet full of people, would ever want to do that for entertainment's sake. And therefore, the game failed. I mean, the game failed for a lot of reasons, but that was a big part of it. The game was so stupidly complicated. So, yeah, those are things that really should drive your system. Having a system of core attributes is recognizable and, dare I say, somewhat marketable. Almost all games have some elements to that. Yes, Fate has aspects which are kind of vague, but they do help to solidify what your character is good at and not good at. Attributes should show aptitudes. They rarely should dictate how you do something, though. For instance, I know plenty of people who, when they come up with an idea, they have their own good idea for something. They will then roll against their, say, wisdom attribute to see if their character could come up with it. It's attempting to get into the character and not let the character take advantage of their big modern brains. So if they're playing somebody who's particularly stupid, they might roll constantly against their intelligence to see if they would know something that the character knows. I applaud the effort, but generally being, somebody who's got his foot in old school games and a foot in modern games at the same time, I think sometimes just giving your character credit that they're in the circumstance, being front and center in a situation, they're often going to be able to have ideas that do transcend, just move forward and attack. Is not unreasonable to give, especially as they get more experience. But, to each their own. I'm not going to say that's the wrong way of doing it, certainly. But they should provide guidelines to answer the question, what am I good at? What is my role? What is my focus? And can I see that I'm very, very good at something? Or can I see that I should stay away from this because I'm very bad at it? That's something that a core system should address as it is needed. Again, if you have a very vague system, then you probably don't need as much in that. But it's still something that's good to have in mind. Now, beyond all of that, much of the character's abilities are going to bleed into the core mechanics and things. So they are in some way tied into your core mechanics. For example, the attributes in Dungeons & Dragons give bonuses that directly apply to core mechanical roles. Your strength will apply to hitting somebody with a sword. Your intelligence will apply whenever you're rolling a skill that's based on what your character knows. And that's all delineated in the character creation process. If you are going to pick a character creation process, you should probably have some idea of that, of why it applies or why you might not want it to apply. For instance, if you want the player to provide all of the brains and all the perspective on the character, you can concentrate on all just physical stats and say, you know what, you come up with your own stuff. You decide what your character knows and doesn't know, and that's valid. That is a way of playing. It may not be the most popular one out there right now, but it's perfectly valid, and you could do that if you wanted to. It's a little bit of modern game design to make broad strokes that describe everything, but describe everything in your character. And for some people, that's comfortable. For other people, that's too oppressive. My players, for instance, playing, again, old school Dungeons & Dragons, really like the fact that not everything is nailed down and they feel like they can try everything. Or run away from things that they fear the consequences of. But it doesn't just come down to a die roll and they do it. And they like that. Some players will grow to like that. Some players will not. They prefer the comfort of knowing specifically what their character can do in a given situation. Knowing probabilities as best as they can conclude. Which, again, perfectly fine. There's no one right way to play, and that's important to understand in game design elements. Now, if you go with something very, very specific, or you go with something very, very broad, that's generally going to speak into your overall mechanics. If you're trying to have something that's approachable and lightweight, or if you want something that's crunchy and very, very focused, both of those can be successful. Again, I'll point to Fantasy Flight's Warhammer 40k system, which was quite successful. Obviously, they put out a lot of books. There was a good audience for them, and they were able to charge a good amount of money for excellent products. Contrast that to Fate and Savage Worlds, which is a much more generally vague system. Fate is exceptionally lightweight. Savage Worlds a little bit more so, a little bit crunchier. But both of them have wildly loyal fan bases because their systems allow you to do so much. Just about anything you can think of, you can come up with rules oftentimes on the fly for Fate. And it's fine. It works along with the rest of the game as long as it serves the narrative purpose of telling the story that you're all combining to tell. If you want a game that is going to be very, very crunchy, best have a good reason for it to draw people in. If it's because it represents an IP that people love, great. If you're going to start out on your own and come up with your own IP and you want to have a really crunchy system, good luck. Get really good art, get other things that draw people's attention, because that's going to be a tougher road to plow. So, understanding your basic core concepts for your character is the first step, clearly, of figuring out how the character mechanics are going to work out and how they impact the system overall core mechanics of the game. The next step, of course, is advancement. The more I play, I want my character to get better. And again, as I said, some games don't have much for advancement. I was working with a brilliant guy named Tim Harper with his own channel, Samwise7, on YouTube. And he came up with a game and he invited me to help him make it. And it was called 18 Inches of Blood. It's going to be one of those darker games. One that I usually don't really run, but I am trying to be open-minded and flexible, and I really liked him. And I was looking at it, and I looked at him like, this is going to be one of those really brutal games where your character is constantly going to be, dragged down by inches in every encounter. And there are elements where you will sacrifice elements of your own character in lasting reasons to try to, achieve success out of the jaws of failure or imminent death and pay a lasting price. I can kind of dig that. It's not my first love, but I appreciate the beauty of a system that lets you do that and really feel like your choices are meaningful and that what happens to your character has a long-lasting effect that can really resonate through your character's whole career. You could lose a leg. You could have your soul burned. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that we were looking into. And these were mostly his ideas. I'm helping to tighten up the mechanics and maybe the editing and stuff, but no, he's the genius behind this one. And I think he's changed the name to something like the Darkest of something. I don't know. So at any rate, but advancement can be a very important part. As far as I'm concerned, as far as 5th edition goes, it is the main purpose of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. The advancement system has become incredibly refined. It exploded in 3rd edition. Now, if you played original Dungeons & Dragons, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons, the feat were still very much in the wargaming roots. Your character would increase, and they would get better and better and better at regular intervals, but the leveling system did not, in general, give you superpowers, did not give you large amounts of abilities, give you a lot of choices in many cases. If you were a fighter, for instance, you got very few advancements as you went up. You just stayed consistently at the top end of the hit points line. You would almost always have the best armor in the group, and your role would remain relatively stable. You'd be the wall between badness and your group, unless your group was bad, and then goodness in your group. You could do that. But as far as 3rd edition, all of a sudden every class had huge amounts of choices. Multi-classing went out of control. Prestige classes became just insane if you really went down the rabbit hole with all the different choices, not all of which were really well play-tested, so there were some really broken stuff that went into some of those books. But you would have all of these options and choices. You were just bombarded. More than some people could take. A lot of people looked at 3rd edition and goes, no, I'll stick to my 2nd edition stuff. Thank you very much. It already has a lot of choices, but I don't like that many choices. I didn't even go with the options books from 2nd edition. Thank you. I'm still running it with just a few kits and stuff. You could do that. 4th edition came along and all of a sudden it was choices, but now it was nailed down choices. You didn't have infinite options. but you had concrete options that would affect your character's abilities in various encounters, and they were all staggered and staged in precisely calculated ways, so that all characters as they advanced would get certain abilities at certain times that would meter out well and balance throughout the whole group. It was probably the most balanced version of Dungeons & Dragons ever. And never let it be said, I don't say nice things every once in a while about 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. But 5th edition is really where it all comes home. There is multi-classing options, but they're much less common because all the nicest abilities are put at the end of the advancement trees. But your characters are constantly going to be getting choices in abilities, powers, and things that are going to make even non-spellcasters cooler and being able to do more and cool things. There aren't any characters that just, ho-hum, I get a few more hit points, maybe my THAC0 drops, but that's it. No, it's designed to keep your interest engaged throughout the process of playing out a character, and that's by design, and it's kind of important. So, leveling is certainly one of the most common ways of advancing a character, and that's not just D&D. Lots of games use levels. It's recognizable. You can tell that a 5th level character is going to be better at things than a 3rd level character, or should be, at the things that they primarily do. You can have your own systems for how they get there. The experience point system that Dungeons & Dragons has is only one. Some systems are as simple as, you succeeded a mission, you go up a level. Congratulations, there you go. And that works for a lot of things. Some of them have explosive growth, like Tunnels and Trolls, for instance. With Tunnels and Trolls, you go up a level. Not only does your character sometimes unlock new abilities and things, but you also get to add to your attributes. Your character explosively gets better at the things that the core definitions of their characters. So, whereas basic Dungeons & Dragons, your characters never improve their attributes unless you drink from a magical spring or you use a wish. That's the only way your attributes are ever going to change. You might as well mark them in marker or pen. But in later versions, it is possible to increase your attributes, and in some games it can be really possible to transform your character over your character's play. So, deciding if that's possible is another element of game design. Deciding if you can increase your fixed attributes, if there are any fixed attributes. If everything can be increased, yeah, that's kind of cool. If it can't, hey, that's cool. There's other ways that you can increase your character or make them better or more potent at what they do. Now, of course, if you're going to go off on your own and come up with your own happy medium, it's kind of hard to get out of the two major ways of advancing your character. Leveling, again, as I said, it's easily understood and often comes with bonuses for leveling, be it new abilities, new powers, attacks, things like that. Often from a list or a pool based on classes. If you have classes and levels kind of go hand in hand in a lot of ways, but not always. For instance, the leveling system of Warhammer 40K's games that Fantasy Flight made is a little bit looser. There's all kinds of abilities that you get within a given span of levels and your predefined class, but the levels, the abilities that you get eventually move you up a level. It's how you spend your experience and what you get better at that eventually moves you up a level. It's just kind of cool. It's a different way of doing things, I think. If looking backwards purely from an experience point of view, yes, it is kind of a get experience, go up a level, but also in a closer view, it's kind of demonstrating that by having all of these skills and having learned things, you're then treated as being better at what you do, which comes with a neat new title and oftentimes different abilities and benefits, quite honestly. So a level system is certainly another way that that people do go about advancing. The other stark view in characters is the point buy system, which is advancing your characters because you spend some sort of currency that you get for gameplay. Maybe with bonuses for good gameplay, so you can advance a little bit faster. There's any number of games that do this. GURPS is probably, again, an exemplar for this, but also the Star Wars, the role-playing game, allowed you to get character points that you could put into your skills to increase your skills. And later games allowed you to also increase your attributes, although that was much more expensive than increasing skills, which could actually change your gaming philosophy. When I played 2nd edition Star Wars, the role-playing game, I would take 1/3 of my character points, I would reserve them for increasing my skills. 1/3 of my character points I would bank for increasing an attribute. And 1/3 I would save for saving my own butt, because you could spend them to give yourself bonus dice to save yourself if you got into a bad scrape. And so that's how I would spend it. But I budgeted, and that was a deliberate design decision that I took based on the system that was around my characters. And you can do that too. But again, I would definitely urge, if you're going to do a point-buy system, take notes from the games that are out there. For instance, got 2 games in mind. Mighty Protectors, Villains and Vigilantes 3.0, which I'm currently running a game of, and GURPS. So, with Villains and Vigilantes 3.0, as you spend points on increasing an ability, say the most raw ability, Power Blast, you spend points, it continually gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Your Power Blasts get more and more devastating. Well, with GURPS, you have a similar thing. You spend character points in your Power Blast ability that you can get from the Supers line of talents, or you can have any reason for it. If you want to say your Psychic has a Power Blast because Psychics are that advanced in your game, yeah, fine. But it has a set number of powers and abilities. So that's pretty consistent between the 2 games. The more points you have, the more damage you can do. There are other aspects that determine how well you hit. For example, Mighty Protectors has an experience levels power that gives you bonuses to your attacks. And also your attribute is the definition baseline for what you attack at. GURPS has a separate skill for using your attack abilities. So you will have power level, which is how much damage you do, and you will have a skill in using that ability, which determines how often you hit, or if your power misfires. So again, it seems to be fairly equitable, although admittedly, the experience levels in Mighty Protectors is far more powerful because it covers everything. It increases your defense, it increases your attack ability, and it also increases your likelihood of succeeding at different tasks and attribute checks. So, whereas in GURPS, because it's more granular, small increases in your abilities can benefit the power. You can inflate the power, or you can inflate your skill and have your ability success more often. The example would be somebody with really high power and really low skill might be able to levitate an elephant and carefully drop him onto a truck. A person with really high levels of skill and low levels of power might be able to levitate a dime and fire it through the slot of a slot machine. So levitate a coin, but yeah. So that's the contrast in that. But take an ability like, let's say, what's the one that's been sticking in my craw lately? We're going to look at duplication. The ability to make duplicates of yourself. With GURPS, that's a pretty powerful ability, and it's going to soak a lot of your points. There's all kinds of rules and restrictions on how you can use it, but yeah, you can make duplicates of yourself, and with the right advantage, you make duplicates that if they get wiped out, it doesn't really affect you all that much. Now, there is a steep point-buy cost for duplicates in Mighty Protectors. It costs 20 points for just being able to duplicate yourself once, but there's no power cost to it. So you can do it, and there's no downside to having a duplicate except that you can take twice as much damage now, because both of you are a target and you kind of share your points and stuff. But there are some characters that there's absolutely no point why you would never immediately duplicate in a crisis. Characters with blasting abilities, yeah, duplicate yourself at the first opportunity, because then you can level, both sets of abilities as quickly as you can. They're somewhat less effective, but it's still a much better option for you in most circumstances. I don't feel that the balancing on that was done particularly well, to the point where, again, no point cost and only relatively small setbacks make some characters just obvious that you would want an ability like this. There doesn't seem to be a lot of choices on why or when you would ever not want to do it. So, those are things to think about with your design decisions in terms of creating characters. But point-buy systems give you a huge amount of flexibility, and one of the most appealing things is they allow your characters to grow organically. They don't every level get a lump of abilities that gets thrown at them. Instead, they buy those as they go, and you can see the growth as they advance, especially if you make them grow in areas that they've used the various skills and abilities. If all you ever do is use one power, that's going to be like the Salvador Dali picture of a man with a massive arm and hand. I know it's a reference to, but that would be an example. If all you ever did was swing a hammer with one hand and you did nothing else, the rest of your body would atrophy and your arm would be super powerful. Much the same way of creating a character that only ever does one thing. If you only can exercise that one ability, then the rest of the stuff is going to stay very substandard, and that ability is going to be huge. And it's going to eventually hit a point where it's extremely expensive to keep upgrading that ability. Improving when you are at low levels is easy. GURPS typifies this by having a small cost for picking up basic levels of skill, and it accelerates in cost as you go up. It plateaus eventually. I mean, you don't have to spend 32 points to increase your chemistry skill after you've hit a certain point, which I think is intelligence +4. But it's going to cost you 8 points every time, which is not inexpensive. Which I think is an appropriate... I always felt that was a fairly appropriate way. If somebody wants to have world-level skills in something, they can, but boy, it's going to cost to get there. So your Neil deGrasse Tysons with the astrophysics that are considered world level, and he obviously put in a ton of work in getting to that point. So yes, there are benefits and disadvantages to both. Characters may lose interest, or players may lose interest in seeing their characters only making slight advancements in a point-buy system, especially if it's really granular. And when I say granular, I mean that there are so many little bits that you can increase at a time. One time I was going to run a game on GURPS where characters were in a magical school learning magical spells. You can draw your own conclusions if you'd like. But the idea was that in GURPS, your level of skill in a particular spell dictated, the number that you would roll. Many of them had prerequisites that you had to know another spell at least the same level as you wanted to increase in the spell that was dependent on it. So if, for example, you need to learn Create Fire before you can make fireballs and throw them at people. And unless you really mastered that Create Fire spell, then that Fireball spell would only ever be as good as you could create fire. Which is fairly understandable. It's a decent mechanic. It works pretty well for it. But the problem was, while it works well realistically, the time it would have taken the players to learn all of the different spells to competent levels would have taken a lot of play sessions to get just their first year schooling in with all the basic stuff that you would want to learn. So, that might not be the ideal system. Despite the fact that I love GURPS dearly, that might not be the ideal system for that kind of premise, unless I'm really interested in a longer-term campaign. Otherwise, I might want to learn some alternate system for leveling, and GURPS does pose some of these. So it's still, I could still use GURPS. I'm pretty confident in it. But if I wanted to run a long storyline with all the loving detail that, say, a very popular British author lavished into her fantasy wizarding world, and had the characters do a lot of stuff in their actual lives that matter to them and were adventures in their own way, then maybe they would get the play experience that they could look at those skills that they've worked to develop along the way and take some pride in that and say, hey, my character may not have Herculean strength. He didn't devote his time and effort into that. But he's a bit smarter now, and he's gotten all of these spells, and I can name all these experiences where I've used these spells over time and really drilled down and mastered them, and I can feel good about that. So there's something to be said for point-buy systems. I am rather partial to point-buy systems myself. My own Spotlight system uses an element of it, but it's not, for the most part, that granular by default, but with the lensing system you can actually get as granular as you want to be in it, I suppose. But by and large, the elements that you have for your character system mechanics should be considered based on the kind of game that you want to run, and again, based on my principles of simplicity, accessibility, and some sort of focus, a catch that really gets people in on things. The more complicated it gets, you will get the casual people who will not be interested in it. The more that it is accessible, it uses systems and mechanics that they already have access to, hey, that's just a foot in the door for you. And then after that, how compelling is your system? How compelling is what you want to do? I see all the time people are like, hey, I want to make my game. And when I press them for details, what's your hook? What really makes you stand out? What makes me want to spend money and buy your game someday? They don't have an answer for that. I just want to make a game. It's not going to cut it. You need something a bit more than that. Why does your game deserve to exist? And that should help to drive your design decisions. Your character creation design, your resolution design should all come off of those things. Now, again, these are systems, and as long as you just take the core system from another game, you're fine. If you take exact things out, you may have problems. But some things are fairly safe. You can take strength and dexterity, for instance, and those are just words at this point. So naming your abilities, strength and dexterity, isn't going to cause you any real problems. Going down the line and stealing all the names of a particular popular game may cause problems. Pull out a thesaurus, use some creativity, if you will. But all in all, that is the other part next to resolution of your mechanics. Character creation and design is another important element. And quite honestly, character creation and design can also drive other things like NPC and monster design. If you have a system of strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, you can give monsters those stats too, and again, delineate, hey, is this monster smarter than the characters? If so, they're probably going to use more smart tactics and, plan and consider better. If the monsters are very, very healthy, that means they're going to have more resilience to damage, which is going to make them a tougher foe. And those elements nailed down under character creation are going to help to expand what you can do with other elements of the game. The two feed into each other, really. However, you don't have to. For instance, if you take, say, Dungeons & Dragons, fair enough. If you look through the old, we're going old school here, old monster descriptions, that is a monster stat block right there. See all that? Not a lot there. No strength, no anything relating to a character. Why? Because you don't need it. For monsters, what's important? How they act, which is in the description, how they attack, what damage they do, and how much resilience can they take. How resistant are they to what the players will try to do? How many can you find at a time? Their general tendencies. That covers it. Then after that, what loot do they have? And whatever else you want to throw in there. But that's all you really need for things like that, and therefore if you don't choose to append that to the attributes and other mechanics for the character creation, you don't have to. It can be its own separate part of your mechanics of the game. So it's an option. And that might make things easier on the people running your game down the road. But as modern Dungeons & Dragons do, it does show all of the stats, strength, dexterity, and intelligence. It does show separate ability blocks for all the different things they can do, just like players have separate abilities slots for their spells and abilities that they can fill out on their character sheets. So how you use those elements, it's up to you. Should it work to serve your game system, you can exclude or include any or all of those. So again, my thoughts on that are that if you are working on a cogent design for your game, that everything works together seamlessly, and it's a tight, compressed game, that everything is accessible and fairly easy to understand and grip, you've got a much better chance than if you come up with something overly convoluted or bloated. You're going to have a much better chance than if you come up with something exotic and special, in whatever way you want to look at that. Yeah, there may be something for a passion project, but if you are actually having your own game studio or you hope to make something for yourself, these are things that a person should consider. And for all the dreamers out there, and I can tell you right now, over my time on social media, I've seen easily in the past 2 years 50 people say, I'm making a role-playing game. You know what? A total of maybe 5 of them have made anything of any significance, and all but one of those never made it to print. It's only available on something like Drive through RPG. That's not saying they didn't succeed. It's published. Good job, you. Farther ahead than I am on that score with my game. But are they living the dream of rich game designers? No. Most game designers will tell you there's no such thing as a rich game designer. Best you can do is have your name on something and hope that there's enough people who like it to, keep it going. So, that is my thoughts on character creation design and advancement design and the principles behind that. Anything in advancement generally is going to be part of your philosophy and how the game works. Anything, even if there is no advancement, that is also a significant part of the philosophy behind your game. It should probably be something that you hearken to in your elevator pitch, your 3-sentence or 2-sentence description of your game that you would tell to somebody to get them interested in your game design. So hopefully that helps. Now I will do another video where I will talk about some of the other elements that John asked me about, but those two things together are my thoughts based on my experiences. And quite honestly, characters and character advancement between leveling and point buy, sure, there's middle ground between the two. There are classless systems that have systems that where you have an almost an a la carte selection of abilities that you can increase. That game I alluded to before in the previous game with 18 Inches of Blood that Tim and I were doing had something similar to that. But realistically, that really ends up just shoehorning you into a class. Maybe it's just a sliding scale of classes instead, even if it's classless. So just something to think about. You'll still gravitate to a particular role, which you could define if you're going to, just say, this is effectively my role, my class, if you would. It just might not bullet point you into what you get at every given level, which is fine. It's fine. Works for a lot of games. So that's another video down, and again, as I said, I've got another one for the other questions going on, which are going to be much more about the modern market and surviving in the gaming world, drawing on my experience, not with the games that I have, but with all the games I see, the people that I talk to in the industry, and some of the things that I observe as I go along. So hopefully you stick around for that one. That'll be part 3 of this series of video responses to John Lanman and the excellent comments that he gave on my Lair of OmnusI 18.5. So thank you very much. Until next time, I'm Rob, and I'll see you soon. Farewell.